person for the Dharma and a Meaningful Life program. So just a couple things, maybe to just some housekeeping. Hopefully all of you have, it looks like you all got into what's called Ruzuku. I wish I had an easier name to say, but Ruzuku is where all of the material for the course program resides. The live sessions that I did last month and we'll do during the month will go in there, and the recording from today will go in there. So everything's kind of housed in one place, which is kind of nice. The other thing about Ruzuku that I kind of like is it's pretty good on the phone, and I know probably all of you look at your phones too much. I know that I do. And so it might be better to look at that than some of the other stuff you look at. And the good thing is, like, you can watch the videos in there. Any of the reading stuff is in there. The only thing is it's not an app, so you have to go to like your Google Chrome or Safari web browser and log in. But usually once you're in, like everything else, it kind of just brings you in. So you can view the information there. And that means as we go through these 8 months, everything that I discuss, that I teach, will follow a kind of sequence. So if you feel like you're behind or you're not really sure where we are, you can always check into there. I've been accused of making people drink from a fire hose, and I don't really know how to stop doing that. I'll do my best. I'll try not to put too much stuff in there. I don't want you to be overwhelmed. So usually each month I'll put a little bit of stuff to read, something to watch, not a lot of stuff. So that way you don't feel like, oh my God, this is all this stuff to catch up with. Today, and generally speaking, the structure of the day, we're here from 10 to 4. Usually what I do is I break the day in half, so we'll go for about 2.5 hours, then we'll take an hour for lunch, and then we'll come back and do the rest of the day. There'll be some teaching, there'll be some meditation practices, there'll be a chance for you guys to do some groups and have a discussion on the stuff that's being discussed. Intentionally, for me, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about and go over and present will probably be, what's the right word? Will maybe not be things that you've heard before. A lot of these ideas are being presented in a new way. So I actually just want to be clear. I have no interest, really. It's not that important to me that you agree with the ideas that I'm presenting. I want you to think for yourself. I think the Dharma is really a self-reflective practice, because a lot of the things that we're going to talk about and the ways, some of the framing of the practice and the theory and the philosophy and the psychology will be counter to what we've maybe read or heard in mainstream, and particularly the insight world. Just because I think, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, I think we need sometimes, in many ways, reframing on some of this stuff. Because it comes from way back when. So really my goal is for you to really think for yourself and to reflect on these ideas and just sort of see, like, as we say in my program, Cultivating Emotional Balance, try it on. Try it on. And also, if you feel like you're new to this and you feel intimidated, I know Dharma practice can be kind of intimidating at first because you're like, oh my God, how much stuff is here? I just want to get it together. How much work is this going to take? The least you know, the better off you'll be in this particular class. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, don't worry. It's the people who have been studying this for a long time who are going to struggle the most, and the person who will probably struggle the most will be me. It's always tricky where to begin. I can't not tell you the amount of time I've spent thinking about what this morning was going to look like. For the last several months. And it really started actually last summer when I was sitting at Vallecitos. If you've ever been up to Vallecitos, if you go way up to the top, there's something called the Upper Meadow, which is a great place to go to. There's these huge trees you can sit underneath, and there's like a whole canopy of shade, and you go sit there for hours. And I was cheating a bit. I was walking back. I actually went up there to sit, and I was listening to a Dharma talk on my phone, which I don't think you're supposed to do. And I was listening to this talk that Stephen Boucher gave, I don't know, 20 years ago, called The Middle Way. And walking back, just kind of with all the stuff that's been going on in the world, I've been like, wow, what does it actually mean to practice a middle way? And I've been thinking about it ever since. So I want to just start there. I think starting at the beginning is important. And what does it mean? First of all, what does it mean to practice anyway? What does it mean to have a practice? Because most of us think like we have a practice. Sometimes I think I have a practice. Sometimes I think I don't really have a practice. Sometimes I feel really in touch with that. I feel like my life and my practice are integrated. Sometimes I feel like they're not at all. And so one of the things that happens for a lot of people, especially over teaching for the last 15 years, is that we get in this weird split where we feel like we have a practice or we want to have a practice. We maybe don't have that all sorted out, but we have a sense of what that is. And then we have the rest of our life. And they a lot of times feel like different things. And it's really, really hard, and it's also really, really important to try to work through that to the point where we'll end actually, hopefully today, is trying to be integrated in that way. So we feel excited about having a practice. We feel like it's relevant. We feel like it's showing up in the areas of our lives, in the day-to-day areas of our lives. And it's not what I call Star Wars Dharma. It's not like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there were people doing this practice, and I'm clearly not one of those people. Right? Because it has its roots in antiquity, trying to bring it into the modern world is actually very challenging. So one of the ways to think about that might be helpful and just really kind of pragmatic is using a kind of Gestalt view on that, which would be, the whole. So if you think of yourself as a whole person, we want to become wholesome. And the word that you hear a lot in Dharma practice is wholesome. And wholesome doesn't mean like I'm a good person necessarily. It doesn't mean like good. It just means complete. I'm the whole thing. And I don't know about you, but when I sit and I look at my life and I look at my inner life, I don't like the whole thing. I'm always getting into the bits and pieces that kind of got to go and the bits and pieces that I like, and I get kind of disintegrated. You might notice this when you sit, just parts of ourselves that we think we want to be rid of. And I don't think I don't think there's such a thing of being rid of. Everything becomes relational. There's how am I relating to my experience, not trying to evaluate what's good and what's bad. And you probably find you struggle with this a lot. I find a lot of people do. And so when we think about a practice, we have really one way to think about it is, so what we'll use here over the next 8 months is the Dharma as really the frame. So I find that I tend to, and a lot of people tend to, we just want one thing that's going to like do all the things. I just need to have a Dharma practice and that will sort out all my woes. But I have found actually that doesn't work so well. I'm, some of you probably know me well, some of you not so much, but I've been in recovery from drug addiction for 20 years. I've done tons of work therapeutically, trauma therapy work, different dynamic work, been 12-step recovery, done a lot of stuff in the emotional intelligence world. So I think we have to be careful that we don't just think that this one thing is going to be the thing that's going to do all the heavy lifting for us. And so with that, the overarching frame is a Dharma practice. And everything else that we put in that frame, all of the pictures in that frame can include everything else that we do. And I would probably argue if we went around, everybody here has probably done some other things that have been very, very helpful. The modern world has lots of different ways in which we can understand ourselves in better ways. We can relate to ourselves in better ways. And at this point, I think it would just be a kind of foolish to not just have at all of it. So if you read the description of the course, that's kind of one of the things that we're going to revisit is ways in which we can integrate things that you're already doing that are helpful to you into the Dharma practice, into a way so that there's a sense of completeness around that. And this is, I think, very empowering because it's very different for everybody. As much as the Dharma can be a universal, the one way to think about it is the Dharma is kind of a map. The framing of the Dharma is a map that helps us, hopefully, navigate the ins and outs of our inner world in a way that's actually pretty precise. And it blows my mind today, like that this guy, this man, Siddhartha Gautama, whoever he was, like really sat under some tree 2,500 years ago and kind of figured out how the damn thing works. You know, with no devices, no technology, just by watching and observing. And that's one of the things I think that's so powerful about the Dharma is it's just the observational power that we can just really fully understand ourselves, right? Just by watching, by tuning into the meditative experience and being able to do that, that he was able to kind of figure that out. So if we think of the map, the Dharma as the overarching frame or the map, you as individuals are the territory. And so this is where I think things like not self and some of the things that we see in Buddhism that get kind of esoteric. We don't want to get into the tricky business because I've done it. One of the advantages you have of working with me is I've made every mistake in this practice that you can possibly make. And I will do my best to make sure that you don't do the same. But there can be a way where we can kind of get in denial about ourselves. We can get in self-rejection. We're like, well, there's not really a self anywhere. It's very easy to slide into nihilism or to slide into, and this used to happen at IMS years ago. They've changed a lot. But I mean, when you would go meet, if you've ever been on retreat, often you meet one-on-one with a teacher, which I never like to do because you get like 10 minutes. And I swear to God, every 10-minute meeting I've ever had with a teacher, I left worse off than when I walked in. Because I'm like, I don't know the person. I'm trying to impress. I don't even know what the hell I'm supposed to do. I'm trying to impress them, or I don't even know. Like, I don't even know you. You don't know me. We have 10 minutes. Like, what are we really going to accomplish here, folks? So I like the group meetings much more. And we often say, you know, we do in Dharma, we do process, we don't do content. Which, you know, in 10 minutes is maybe helpful because we can't get into, well, I was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1974, and my dad was an alcoholic and went to Vietnam. It's like, okay, that's 8 minutes, dude. Like, what do you want to talk about? So the content, what I'm trying to get at here is the content matters. Your content matters. You matter. Everything that has happened to you matters. It all matters. It's all relevant. The content is super important, actually. And so I think that that's a very different way to practice. We want to kind of become ourselves more than to be rid of ourselves, which is something that you might have saw in the course which is really the way that we think about authenticity, which I want to just talk about for a minute. I think some people maybe mentioned it in some of the comments and the things is that, you know, certain words culturally become hyped, and then like when something becomes hyped, I don't like it. But I'm like trying to not do that anymore because a lot of the stuff is good stuff, like meaning, like a meaningful life, right? Like that's in the title. Like some people are like, oh God, here we go, the meaningful life thing. But it's like really important actually, just because society and mainstream culture has kind of commodified and ruined some of these words. I think we need to take them back. Sorry, you can't have that word. That's how I feel about the word mindfulness. You can't have it. That's our word. I feel that way about authenticity. That's a good word. You can't ruin that word. Meaning, you can't ruin that word. Because authenticity is, in academic circles and certainly philosophical circles, it's what they would call a virtue of modernity. Like the Greeks, the Stoics, ancient philosophies, they didn't talk about authenticity, because there was not a social dynamic that was advanced as ours now. So authenticity is a virtue that is a psychosocial virtue. It's something that's very much important about how we relate to the world and how we relate to other people and how we relate to society. And you know this, right? When you meet somebody who presents with some degree of authenticity, we're immediately attracted. We immediately notice it when we see it, generally. And we generally feel a little bit like engaged. In a way. So it's kind of a virtue of modernity. And it's something that I think that we can utilize in a way as a kind of maybe a goal. Because one of the things I put in the course is that kind of the theme that we revisit here over and over again is understanding, and this is just an idea. I think it's something that you can struggle with, you can wrestle with, you can think about it. Largely by the work of some of the people I've been talking to recently, people like John Vervaeke. I put one of his, if you didn't watch that, he's brilliant. But this idea that you matter, And what matters to you is what's relevant, and what's relevant is really, really important. Right? So there's a way in which we're kind of putting ourselves front and center. And to think of wisdom, which is a word that we hear in the Buddhist tradition a lot, which is kind of a strange word, to be honest with you. In fact, for years and years and years, as a Buddhist teacher, I should probably know what wisdom is. But sometimes I think to myself, I'm like, I actually don't have any idea what wisdom is. It doesn't mean anything, really. And we all have a vague kind of sense of what wisdom actually means. But I think if someone pressed me, if someone interviewed me on a podcast and told me to, what is Buddhist wisdom? What is wisdom? I would be embarrassed because I wouldn't have much to say. Like, we associate wisdom with knowledge, which is totally incorrect. Part of knowledge is part of wisdom. But it's really when we start to see how we live our lives in an authentic way, in a meaningful way. Wisdom is not what you know. It's not a know that. It's what you know how to do. So wisdom in Pali, the word panya, is actually a verb. It's not a bit of information that you have or that you don't have. It's the knowing how to live in a way where you're aligned with your values, you know what your values are, you relate to other people in a way that you feel like you can be honest, you can be yourself. It's a very, very dynamic skill. Right? And it may be different for everybody. So wisdom, again, is what you know how to do. It's not about what you know. Which is a different kind of framing, I think, of that. And I think when we want to develop wisdom or a meaningful life, I would just use those words synonymously because that means something to me. I want to have a meaningful life. I suspect you do. I'm sure many of you have a meaningful life or have periods of time that have been meaningful. And the thing about meaning that's interesting, and this largely comes from the work, some of you are probably familiar with this woman who's quite popular now named Brene Brown. She's a qualitative researcher, and what she's done all this research on meaning, probably more research on meaning than anybody I can imagine. And so she would do. They've interviewed, I think, maybe over 100,000 people now. And what they do in the interview is they ask people to describe meaningful experiences in their life. To tell me about a meaningful experience you had. Tell me about something that you went through that was meaningful. And the one thing that's interesting about that I'll talk about later this morning is not always, but by and large, when people tell a story about something in their life that they went through or something happened that was meaningful, it usually is a story about something they went through that was really painful. Right? Meaningful experiences are often tied to tremendous suffering, tremendous loss, tremendous struggle. And they talk about going through these experiences and coming out the other side, and they realize something about themselves. They realize something about the world. They realize something about how they were living, and they actually didn't really want to live this way because it's this meaningful experience they had. Maybe they changed courses. So meaningful doesn't mean pleasant or enjoyable. I think that's the trap that we get into. Like, I want to have a meaningful life. I'm like, do you? I don't know that everybody does. I think a lot of people just want to get what they just want. Happiness is measured by getting the things that I want and avoiding the things that I don't want. And if I could succeed in that, then I would be happy. But most of us, if you're sitting here, I suspect that's not been your experience. And it puts us in this different relationship with trying to understand the hard things that we go through and how to bring them out in a way that is meaningful. So it's important that we understand that, this is where the wires generally get crossed for human beings. And the Buddha was onto this many, many years ago, which is what I call caveman thinking. Pleasant, good, unpleasant, bad. Got to get the pleasant, got to avoid the unpleasant, which is like totally as wired in as any instinct that we have. It's probably the most fundamental wiring that we have. Right? And we start to see that actually that method doesn't really work so well. And even like things like we'll talk about this afternoon, but like basic Dharma teachings, like the 5 hindrances, craving, aversion, restlessness, lethargy, and doubt. We hear so much about those. And we think about them as being unskillful states of mind, and we want to overcome these unskillful states of mind. And we think, yeah, I totally want to do that. But the reality is when I'm in craving and aversion, I find it to be very enjoyable some of the times. You know, you ever just be sitting around thinking about some shit that you want and how great it's gonna be when you get it. Oh, it's like, when we're in these experiences, we're like, you know, craving an aversion, kind of like it. Right. So again, that's where the wires get drawn. A lot of times, destructive things, that's a strong word, but destructive, unskillful, being caught up in dimensions of our mind that we think we want to be free from, when we're doing them and we're in them, we're like, oh, that's kind of nice. And that's what makes it so complicated. So one of the things that we'll talk about, and I'll just kind of try to address now, which has been a big part of my work, is trying to look at what I call secular Dharma, and I'll kind of talk about what that is, because I think that if you're not a monk or a nun, you're kind of practicing secular Dharma just by default. And so what that means is, when we look, this is kind of where Buddhism gets to be slippery, is probably most of us know, up until very, very recently, like the last 50, 60 years, the practice of the Dharma and the practice of the religion of Buddhism has been largely contained in a monastic environment. All of the different schools, the 7 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, the Zen traditions and all their schools, and the Theravada, there's all these different schools. They've all been sort of in a monastic setting, which is fine. I have nothing against that at all, except for I'm not doing that. So, I have kids, and I pay taxes, and I deal with society, and I deal with money, and I deal with sexuality, and I deal with all kinds of stuff that people in a monastic setting don't deal with. Maybe they're onto something, actually. Maybe we'd all be better off in the brown robes. And so because of that reality, the way that the path is kind of understood is confusing, in the sense that a religious, so we could just say a monastic Buddhism, a monastic Dharma is a kind of religious practice. Most of those, I think most people, if you talk to them, and I've talked to many monks about this, they consider their practice to be religious. You might consider your practice to be religious. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And what that really means, though, is that they are embarking in a process that is meant to be purification and transcendence. The Buddhist monastic path is really about transcending this world, where they actually don't deal with society, they don't deal with money, they don't deal with sexuality, they don't have families. They by choice don't do a lot of the things that most of us have chosen to do. Again, maybe they're onto something. And their goal is to really purify the mind, purify the behavior, and to transcend this world. And really what that means is to never be born again in a human body. It's kind of, and that is what they call satirya. That is the goal of kind of a monastic Buddhist practice, which I actually, again, I don't have any interest in that. In fact, if I die and go to some kiosk and get and presented with a set of options, I'd come back and I'd do this again. It's been weird, it's been challenging at times, but for the most part, I find it to be rather enjoyable, and if nothing else, very humorous. And so, again, I'm not trying to say that that's bad or that's wrong. It's just, it puts us in a position as people who live in the secular world, live in contemporary society, where we come up against a lot of things where we're really not so sure about this. So as we're trying to practice within a frame, if we're not totally bought in, if we're not convinced, then our ability to practice something like this with some degree of sincerity will waver. I know that's been my experience. I don't know if you ever had this. Sometimes I find myself sitting in the morning. I'm like, why do I even do this? It's 5 o'clock in the morning. You're just going to sit here on a cushion. Like, what do you think you're going to get out of this day? Of course, that's the doubt hindrance. But still, I get that a lot. I'm like, this again with the breathing thing? Because a lot of times I'm not bought into that. So when we think about, so that's kind of the traditional Buddhist framing that some of you, you'll all have to negotiate this on your own. And I think it's important that we struggle with this, because it's the outcome of doing it is worthwhile. It's worth it. And so a secular Dharma practice, a this world practice, the life that you live in, you matter, your content matters, is we want our practice that's relevant and transformative, right? So what's relevant to you, what's relevant to me and what's relevant to you, it might be very different, right? And what John Vervaeke calls the process of wisdom, one of the things that we do is we go through this process with what's called relevance realization. And that means we realize and we understand authentically for ourselves that which is very relevant to my sense of happiness, my sense of purpose, my sense of meaning, my sense of well-being. What matters? You know, like, why do you get out of bed in the morning? You know, why did you come all the way over here? You know, like, and so when we're more engaged with what's relevant, then what we can do is we can transform the ways in which we experience ourselves internally, the way that we experience the world externally, and then both and, which is actually in the mindfulness teachings, weirdly enough. The Buddha is asking us to be mindful internally, mindful of the internal, self-aware, we would say in emotional intelligence context. Am I aware of my inner world? Am I aware of the external world? And am I aware of the interplay between those two? Right? And so that's really good because that puts us in a position where we're tuned into what matters. And why that's important, and this goes into the digital media and the kind of problems, some of the problems that we are currently facing in the world right now, is, I'll be honest with you, I spend a lot of time, more time than I would like to admit, paying attention to and getting worked up and upset about things that really aren't that relevant to my life. You know? And the phone, the algorithms in our phone are designed specifically for you to get pulled out of what's relevant, what matters, and what's meaningful. You ever find yourself just getting really worked up about something and you get to the end of it, you're like, you know what, I actually don't really give a shit about this, you know? But it's so addictive. You know, that rage bait, they call it now. It's just like this way in which, you know, we feel like the more upset we are about the state of the world or the state of the country, the more we care, or the more, you know, it's like really this really bizarre feature of experience. And a lot of us, when we reflect on it, it's not that relevant to us, actually. It's not that transformative. Transformative is, again, how we change. And so we would say, another way to say that would be a monastic Buddhist practice about transcendence. That's the salvation. In salvation, I don't like the concept of salvation because, first of all, I come from a sort of Christian Catholic background in which that idea didn't appeal to me early on anyway. But there's something disempowering about salvation because it's kind of like has a like come save me idea. I need to be saved, which I find to be kind of disempowering. Whereas kind of relevant realization model, relevant transformative model is really about redemption. It's about resilience. It's about actively engaging in the struggles that we're in, really being in the life that we're having, and really doing the hard work of finding out what is meaningful, what's relevant, and participating in those things. Right? And if you just kind of take what I'm saying and you put it in the context of a 20-minute meditation, like I just sit and I do this most days. I sit in meditation and I find my attention getting caught up in things that are irrelevant. And then what do? I recognize that with mindfulness. I say, okay, this is not what I intended to do. I recognize that. I let that go. I let that be, and then I come back to the present moment. I come back to that which is relevant, which is my life. So you're doing this all the time anyway. If we're doing this all the time anyway, it's really nice to contextualize that and say, and so there's a practice for you. You know, noticing ways in which we get caught up in these things that aren't relevant and meaningful to us. So just another way, I think I've said this before, but I just want to kind of see if I can bring us into the moment that we're in and how we can use some of the ideas to kind of get a sense of where this might be going. There's three things I just want to name that are happening in the world, I think, that are really relevant to why we would maybe want to have a practice like this. And the first one, and I think the most interesting one, is what we call the mindfulness revolution. 10 years ago on the cover of Time magazine was a pretty white lady with her eyes closed, and it said the mindfulness revolution. And mindfulness is everywhere now. It really is. And I've talked to people about this. I interviewed Stephen Batchelor and Joseph Goldstein, and I always asked them, I said, you know, Joseph, like back in the 70s, did you ever think, or did you all ever hope that mindfulness would ever become as popular as it has? And he's always laughed. He's like, we never in a million years would have thought that mindfulness would be everywhere in the way that it is. And I think it's actually a good thing. And why is that? Why is that? It's because everything I just said. People are, we seemingly have everything we would ever want in the modern world. We have all the digital goodies, all the food, all the stuff here, and nobody's happy. Why are people so unhappy in modernity? I mean, there's a million reasons why. We could spend all day talking about it. That might not be that relevant, but what people are doing is like, well, maybe there's something in here. I think there's an interest in people are turning towards their inner experience, trying to think maybe there's something I can do, And because of the mindfulness revolution and the fact that it's been around for kind of 25 or 30 years now, people are really turning towards wisdom traditions to try to come to terms with the suffering of modernity, the lack of meaning, what Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. People are looking backwards and going, did anybody in the past ever have any good ideas about how to live life? And it's like, yeah, actually they did. Like there was a report I read, like Stoicism, for example, is like really popular now. And they say more books in the last year were sold on Stoicism than the last 25 years combined. All these people, they're looking back. They're looking at wisdom traditions. They're looking at antiquity. They're saying, okay, like the modern world doesn't have anything helpful. And people are turning. I think people are doing mindfulness and they're looking backwards and they're trying to say, they're looking for really a kind of new philosophy. Philosophy is kind of coming back because people are realizing that they're unhappy and that and even young people, a lot of young people I work with, some of you maybe have young people in your lives or children or people you talk to somebody in their 20s, in their mid-20s, they're like, yeah, they look at the world, they're like, yeah, there's nothing here for me. I'm never going to have a house. I don't even want to go to college. I don't want to have a mortgage on my college degree. And maybe younger people are really, really in this a lot more because they look at the world and they're like, yeah, I don't see much on offer that's going to allow me to have a meaningful life. And so they're kind of looking within. The inner life, I often say, it's sort of the final frontier. Right? And then with those first two things, there is this gigantic conversation that's been going on and it continues to go on and gets more and more dynamic between cognitive science and Buddhism. And that because of neuroscience and because of mindfulness, there's a lot of interest in trying to understand the mind and what is the mind really? How does the mind work? How can I use the mind as an instrument? Because that's really what the early Buddhist psychology would say, that the mind is the instrument that you use to cultivate the meaningful life that you want to have. And so you have these cognitive scientists and Buddhist meditators and Buddhist psychologists and having these conversations about this right now. And the question is, did the Buddha really did he really figure it out? And they're like, yeah, we think maybe he did. And so that's been ongoing for a long, long time. And I think that's really exciting. That can be a really exciting way to think about things. So I hope you guys with me so far. Is this making sense? I hope so. Because then when we go back, if we just go way, way back, right, to the kind of the first thing that the man said, recorded at least in the Pali text, is that the first thing out of his mouth was, I awoke to a middle way. And right now, I don't know about you, but if you look around, when I look at the world and I look at society and I look at the current state of affairs, we are so not middle. Like middle is just not even, I don't even know what middle would even look like. And so it's interesting that now you have to realize too, if you look at the Buddhist historical context, a lot of times we read these mythological stories of him in the palace and all that kind of stuff, and we just imagine this kind of enlightened prince like wandering around ancient India giving these wonderful discourses about how to, not the case at all. The world that he lived in was a nightmare. There was genocide, there was war. Towards the end of his life, his total family got wiped out. They were fighting amongst themselves. He was like traveling far away. His main funder, his main supporter throughout his whole life, the greatest supporter of the Dharma monastic community was a man named King Pasenadi, who was kind of the leader he was kind of the king of Kosala. And I'm not going to name names, but he's very similar to somebody in the modern discourse, actually. The similarities are scary. And at the same time, the Buddha had had a long-standing, really constructive relationship with Pasenadi because he knew that he had to. If you look in the Pali Sutras, most of the discourses the Buddha gave were at the deer park, or the deer park at Isipatana or Jedis Grove. You know, you read the Pali Canon, which is not fun to read if you have. It usually says, such and such a time and a place, the Buddha sat down at Jedis Grove and he gave a discourse to the monk on such and such a thing. Well, the Jedis Grove and Deer Park and all these wonderful places where the monks all lived and got food and had all things were all provided by King Pasenadi. He was very generous to the Buddha. He was also a terrible tyrant. And the Buddha was probably in many ways probably the first. He was really more of a social activist than anything, really. And he was able to navigate the complexity of the ancient world and was able to really handle things in a middle way because he saw that you really had to be in the middle around these things. And that's really, really, I think, a tricky business. And when he talks about awakening to a middle way, usually we think about them as a middle way between excessiveness, which is not totally correct. The word that he uses is antaka, which means a dead end. And so I'll just kind of give you some of the ways you could think about this before we take some questions and some practice. So you could say we want to find a middle way between being excessive and deficient. In fact, if you look at the definition of equanimity, which is kind of the mental quality that we try to develop here in the Abhidharma, the definition of equanimity is being able to be in the middle of an excess and deficiency, not too much, not too little. Right? And I don't know about you, I'm terrible at that. You know, like that's really hard. We could say, a middle way between religion and science. A lot of people think religion has all the answers. I think clearly it doesn't. A lot of people think science has all the answers. Clearly it doesn't. What is a middle way between science and religion? I don't know. You know, how do we negotiate these things? One of the ways he talks about it is a middle way between this is and this is not. Truth and false, which is like really where we're divided right now around information. You know, the war between true and false right now is just insane. And the Buddha's like, he's like, I don't do that. Right? He's really hard to pin down for an answer. A middle way, probably for a lot of us in this society right now, is trying to find a middle way between poverty and capitalism. You know, and some of us, we gravitate one way or not. A lot of people in this practice, myself included, a lot of people I work with have a kind of poverty mentality, a scarcity kind of mentality, you know, where we think, well, money is capitalism, it's all evil and bad, and we don't want no part of it. Right? But the Buddha also, too, was able to use the leaders of his day, some of the wealthy merchants and stuff. He was able to get them to support a lot of the stuff that he did. So he must have been. The one thing I'll just say before we move on, I think is interesting about him, when people in the academic world or people in the kind of studying of Buddhism world, there's one thing that the Buddha was really good at, and nobody knows why. Like what if we look at him as a historical figure rather than a religious figure, what was his primary skill and where did he get it? The thing that he was so good at, we don't understand, is why he was so good at communicating with other people. You know, I mean, a lot of these people like the Buddha, if you look at time and you look at history, most of them got killed, murdered. You know, almost every one of them. How did the Buddha manage to not get killed? I mean, they tried to kill him 3 times. He was so good. He was such a skilled communicator, you know, that he was really a social activist and really, really strong political figure of the day. It doesn't make any sense as why he was so good at that, where he got those skills. But when you look at him, we think about him as this meditator and his enlightened mind and his Dharma and all the stuff, which I think is fascinating. But one thing that they say they don't understand is how did he get so good at communicating? And so how do we find this way of sort of being more in the middle of our experience? So let me just pause there. Effort. So I think this is a good place to start. If I was to start the Eightfold Path, which I kind of am right now, I think the one that makes the most sense, at least teaching a course, this is like the fifth time I've taught this course. Effort's a good place to start because it gives us a sense, and I'll tell you why the word effort's not really so good. When you look in the early discourses, the farther back you look in the Pali text, eventually you see the most fundamental definition of the path. And the most fundamental definition of the path is an ethical definition where the Buddha is saying the path is about developing wholesome mental states and abandoning unwholesome mental states. Okay, now we have to be careful. Wholesome doesn't necessarily good and unwholesome doesn't necessarily mean bad. We have to be careful we don't turn it into a moralistic project, which is hard not to do. So we could say wholesome could be wholesome. It could be skillful. We hear that word a lot around here. That's a good word. Wholesome, skillful, constructive would be the word they would use in emotional intelligence. In a really colloquial sense, we could just say healthy. I want to live in a healthy mind. I want to develop a healthy mind. And so we want to develop an unhealthy mind by cultivating qualities. We want to overcome or abandon the unhealthy, destructive dimensions of our mind. And that, again, might be different, a little different for everybody. So this never gets discussed, which I find to be odd. There's a number of terms that we find that speak to this. So when you see, let's start with the path factor, effort, is this word vayama, sama vayama. Vayama doesn't really mean effort. It can mean a lot of things. It could mean strength. It could mean effort. It could mean endeavor. The word that probably makes the most sense is application. So it's like, okay, like I want to cultivate unwholesome states of mind and let go of unwholesome states of mind. That doesn't require grit. That doesn't require striving. It's not, it's not an act of will, which is where it gets a problem. Most people try too hard anyway. You ever been on a meditation retreat and tried too hard? It's brutal. Brutal. It's not about trying or striving. It's about, well, how do I apply the mind? What's the application? So that's the word for this path factor. There's another word that shows up all over the place in all the different lists, which is this word virya, which is a really important word, which is usually translated as energy, which is not a great translation because the word energy, again, doesn't really mean anything. The word virya has a very positive connotation to it. It even is more like a courage. And courage is a word I think that we would put under a wholesome, positive spin. It's about courage. It is also about energy, but it's about even enthusiasm or optimism. It's a kind of, virya is like, I can do this. It's that I can do. It's got strength, it's got courage, it's got efficacy. It's got so many important, beautiful things in it. To call it energy is just kind of like disrespectful. So virya is a very important word in ancient India. And that's another word that fits in here. There's also another word called padana, which sometimes means endeavor. So if you look in the Vizuko, there's a bunch of words most of these Pali words, when you try to get the English equivalent, there's no one-to-one for almost any of these damn words, frankly. You need like 7 words, English words, to get somewhere in the territory of we're talking about. So this is why I think when we talk about effort, we can kind of think about this as an application. And then in the teaching gets teased out a little bit further, which is really, really helpful. And now you've probably heard this. People give talks on this all the time, and I think it's good. What are called the 4 great efforts. There, I use the word effort now after having said all that. But I tend to use the traditional word just so we know, the territory that we're in. And this is very interesting because this really indicates, and we'll do a practice on this here in just a little bit, the ethical dimension of that. And when I say ethical, really kind of more what I mean is integrity. And probably more what I mean is your ability to have your actions and your behaviors to be aligned with your values. It's really about alignment, right? And we notice that one of the things that's guaranteed in an unwholesome mind state is when I act or behave out of accordance with my own values. You ever do or say something you regret later and you feel like shit? You feel guilty, you feel ashamed, or you feel just kind of like, what's that? No. Well, you should be sitting up here then. Because, and also the reason why this is so important is we're all different. You know, we all probably have, if we went around the room, there's probably many values that we all share, but there's probably some values that for us as individuals are really, really important. So it's really actually about alignment. So the first great effort, and this always confused me, the first effort is to prevent unwholesome states from arising in the mind. And I was always like, well, how do you do that? Because I don't know about you, but there's some unwholesome stuff that arises in my mind seemingly out of nowhere, right? And also the other thing to remember too, in Buddhist psychology, there are no thought crimes. It's once when they start to get into speech, into action, that's when things become destructive. And so how do you do that? Well, to live with integrity. For those of you in recovery, you really get this one. You know, is that when I am living in a way that's in line with my values, I don't feel bad about it. In emotional intelligence, they use the word a regrettable emotional episode. A regrettable emotional episode is something that you did or said or didn't do or didn't say when you were emotional that you regretted later. Right? And I don't know about you, but I have a couple of these a week. You know, and I've reflected on what happened. Well, what happened was I was in a reactive state of mind. I was upset. I was overwhelmed. I was angry. And for me, most likely, I said something to somebody that I care about that I really wish I hadn't said. And I feel bad about that. And that doesn't make me a bad person. It just gives me some evidence to suggest, okay, well, what was going on? What was going on? How can I work on that? And so that's how we prevent these unwholesome forces from arising in our mind, is by living with some degree of sila or some degree of integrity. And you're not going to get it right. You're going to fail a lot, and that's okay. You know. And so we just have to be careful about that. I'd also, another way to say that that's relevant, I think, especially because of the world we live in right now, is one of the other ways you prevent unwholesome forces from arising in your mind is you be careful where you put your attention. If you watch the news on YouTube, I guarantee you within 3 to 5 minutes, you will be in an unwholesome state of mind. Right? So it's about, we talk about this on insight retreats, they talk about guarding the senses. Be careful, whatever you pay attention to comes with tremendous consequence, without a doubt. So that's a whole practice in and of itself. That's the first one. The second one and the third one are good to talk about in pairs. So then what we want to try to do is we want to prevent these unwholesome forces from arising in the mind, and we want to overcome destructive forces that have arisen in the mind. And this is where the mindfulness practice, this is sort of the game of mindfulness, and that is, it says right in the Satipatthana Sutta, when I have anger, and when the meditator has anger in their mind, you know you have anger in your mind. When you have ill will it's in my mind right now. I can see it in my mind. Joseph Goldstein does a good job of talking about this, and this is where it gets a little bit hard. It's important that we can notice when we have destructive forces in our mind without feeling bad or wrong for having it in my mind. This is the real big trick. Because what happens is, if we can't make that distinction, we tend to be in denial, or we kind of will bullshit ourselves a little bit, or we'll justify we have the destructive force into my mind. Well, I have this terrible destructive force in my mind because of all this other stuff that happened, and if that other stuff didn't happen, I wouldn't be like this. I mean, it's not even my fault. I mean, look at what you're doing. So, but that's a lot of times because we can't separate. This is why in meditation it's so important that they use, especially in the Theravada Burmese lineage, of being able to see things as kind of objects. Anger is an object in my mind. Contempt is an object in my mind. And to not feel bad or wrong, like, what kind of a person? I have that once in a while. You ever catch yourself thinking about some really, really, not so great stuff? And then you're like, what kind of a person thinks about this stuff? Only a bad person like me would have thoughts like this. And it's like, no, there's no thought crimes. But what happens is we're taking it too personally. So with mindfulness, we want to be able to recognize the presence of these sort of destructive forces. That's just a word I use. There's a bunch of words. Sometimes they're called defilements or unskillful. I like the word destructive. Destructive because they're dead ends. They don't go anywhere. They don't end up anywhere good. They go round and round and round. They have a looping quality. Another way to say that in the context of mindfulness is we're trying to recognize and overcome the 5 hindrances, right? That'll keep you busy all day. Just wake up tomorrow and just spend most of the day noticing when the hindrances are in your mind and try to overcome them. You won't get anything else done, right? And so that's really what we're trying to do, and we're trying to. So this is the other thing too, is you want to be able to recognize the destructive forces in your own mind. You want to see it, right? And this is where you feel like you'll get a downgrade, because the more you practice mindfulness, the more you're going to see these destructive forces in your mind, and you're going to start thinking like, man, I'm getting worse. But that's not actually what's happening. There was a study they did many years ago that indicates this in a funny way. They basically did 2 test groups. They did a test of long-term meditators and people who had no meditation experience. And they asked them to score themselves on their abilities. Like, are you able to stay focused on the task at hand? Does your mind wander? Are you able to pay attention? And the people who didn't meditate scored themselves really high. They're like, are you able? Oh yeah, I'm able to, oh yeah. And the meditators, the more skilled meditators, the more advanced the meditator, the worse of a score they gave themselves. Right. You see how this gets like this? And so don't be hard on yourself if you start to practice with more diligence, and you just start seeing that there's more trash in the stream than you thought. You're like, oh my God, this is like garbage city over here. It's just like, it's not that it's just you're seeing what was already there anyway, and which is what you want to do. But don't be careful about that, because it can really feel, I know that for me over the years, every time I take more trainings, I'm like, oh God. At one point I was like, yeah, hindrances, man, I totally got rid of those. And then you go on a retreat, you're like, oh my God, it's like every 8 seconds. But that's what it does. It makes it really, really a lot more realistic that way. And so that's really kind of what we're trying to do. So this is really helpful, because now we're knowing what the application is. Mindfulness for what purpose? This is really the application of mindfulness. And the problem with this is, if you read and study the Satipatthana Sutta, which probably many of you have done, a lot of people have done, when you take a teaching out of the context of the path and you look at it on its own, the Satipatthana Sutta has absolutely nothing to say about any of this, because the assumption is that you've already understood it. So these teachings aren't in there. So when you just look at the teachings on mindfulness by themselves, you can get to the point where you're like, I don't even know what the hell I'm supposed to be doing. Right? But this is the fundamental. This is very fundamental. And so then we get into the second. So the first 2 efforts are about preventing these forces from arising in our mind by living with integrity, and by having a practice and noticing when they come up and being able to not be so consumed by them. And then the third great effort is to develop or to cultivate wholesome mental states, constructive mental states. And the first one is mindfulness. So here, mindfulness is understood in the Buddhist context of, in itself, mindfulness is a wholesome mental factor. You always get these analogies about the mindful sniper and all this kind of. Why anybody would want to argue that mindfulness is not wholesome is just silly to me. Because with mindfulness, there is a quality of integrity built right into it. It's basically saying, I want to be aware of my inner life. And so we want to develop that. And so what you have in the mindfulness context, in the 4th foundation of mindfulness, you have these 5 hindrances. You want to recognize those and abandon those. And you want to recognize and develop the awakening factors, in which there's 7. They're probably in the course. I'll put them in there. I'm not going to go through all of them right now. But that gives us a really great application, right? That's very, very doable. The first 2 are mindfulness and interest, and being engaged, being interested. My wife is the master of this one, because she can have really constructive conversations with people who hold very, very bizarre views about the world, which I am not very good at. I can do it for a certain period of time, and then I lose it. Right, because she's so interested in how people came to their perspectives. Like, wow, you really think that? What has happened in this person's life where they have arrived at some of these views? And this is really helpful right now. So can we be more curious? Can we be open? And that's really where we start bridging the gap, where we start not being so dictated by the destructive dead-end loopings of the mind and being like mindful and interested and mindful and interested. How people came to the perspectives that they've come to. How is it that you've come to see it that way, rather than just being like, well, you're obviously wrong about a whole bunch of stuff, clearly. You know? And that's really, if you look at our culture, this is like the teaching that everybody needs. You know, how do we be interested in other people's point of views? Can we be interested or curious in the fact that maybe I'm not right about this? You know, and then we can apply that. And this really applies to that first path factor of views and opinions, and how easy it is to get dug into those. So we want to develop those, and then we want to maintain them. And so that's really kind of how the effort structure works. Now to say everything I just said and just calling that effort, you see how quickly that falls short? It doesn't give us much of a thing. And so when you go to usually when you hear about mindfulness, or you go take a Vipassana course or whatever, usually when you hear about meditation, you hear a lot about mindfulness and concentration, but you don't hear much about effort, which I think is problematic. Because effort is the application. Okay, now I know what the application is. Now I can employ the mindfulness as the strategy on how I'm actually going to be able to do that, rather than just be mindful and everything. Because the message is that, right? Be mindful and things are going to work out just fine. I don't know about that. You know, I find that the more mindfulness I have, the harder shit gets. Because we get to deeper levels, we get to deeper thresholds. So that's quite a bit right there, but I just want to pause right there. Is there any more you want to know about? Does this make sense to you? See why something like the word effort doesn't quite do enough to give us a sense of what we're trying to do with our mind?
Can you just clarify
Yeah.
Sorry, can you just clarify the second one?
Yeah, is to prevent,
No.
not to prevent, is to overcome or
Overcome.
abandon. I use the word overcome. Destructive forces that are in the mind right now, which is really like so much of the work. So much of the work. Because again, let's just be honest with ourselves. Like, we hear that and go, yeah, I totally want to do that. Like, I want to overcome destructive forces in my mind. But when we start looking at things like the hindrances, sometimes when we're in them, they feel good. So then all of a sudden overcoming it doesn't look so interesting. It's like, oh no, I kind of like this. It's pleasant. Aversion can be very pleasant. Yeah, safe. Greed, it can be. So, you know, again, as much as we can think to ourselves that we really are invested in the project, in the moments of our lives, we might find that we're not so willing to. I'm like, yeah, I'll overcome this, but give me like 20 minutes, you know, like I'm kind of enjoying this right now. Yeah, Sarah.
Maybe my brain has gone to the too literal, but when you say application, would you apply like loving kindness, or like, I mean, is it any of kind of the awakening factors?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, I think that's a good line of questioning. Like what, you know, like if I have, so let's just say, like, let's just play that out. So if I have a lot of aversion and resistance in my mind, I might recognize that, but just recognizing it's not enough. Maybe I need to apply some kindness to that and say, no, it's okay. Like, I'm having a hard time right now. Like that's a great question, because that's really what we're looking for. Like, well, what's going to help, you know? Like, because people a lot of times will confuse mindfulness with recognition. And because I recognize I have aversion in my mind, I assume that it should just, it's like, I did number 2. Why is it still here? It's like, well, you're not done. You know, it's like maybe there needs to be kindness, or who knows. But just by doing that, what you're doing is you're taking, if we think of a hindrance as an obstacle, we're taking that obstacle and we're actually turning it into an object. And now I'm working with it contemplatively. I'm recognizing, I'm interested in maybe even trying to overcome it. Whereas before, I'm just in it. I'm just like, this shit needs to be different. And when I get convinced that shit needs to be different, I'm not interested in working with it. I'm interested in shit being different and what I'm going to do to make it different. And I get really invested in that. And so, with mindfulness, mindfulness says, hey, wait a minute here. You got this thing going on. You probably don't want to be putting any more gasoline on this. And you're like, oh, well, what else should I put? Well, where's the water? You see what I mean? And so that's where it becomes, a little bit of a trial and error, and then you start to learn. You're like, okay, like aversion, if I'm a little more kind, it backs off a little bit. And you start to get some freedom from some of this stuff.
Could virya be willingness?
No, I would be hesitant to use that one. Very, again, to try to give it one word, I know is very tempting. It could be, it's definitely part of it. I mean, courage takes willingness, right? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. In the back there.
It's Spock's brain again. I'm here in person now.
Oh, nice. I thought you looked familiar. You're tripping me out. I'm like, wait a minute.
I was a little late this morning, so I stayed at home and came at lunch.
Did you fly here on your spaceship?
Spock's brain is not on a spaceship. It's in Spock.
Okay.
Yeah. So a word that stuck out to, and I find it very interesting with these translations, because English, in essence, is a very limiting language when you're trying to relate ancient languages or tribal languages. And that's a lot of times why there is a block between understanding things in English and these ancient concepts.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned the word courage.
Yes.
Well, if you break that word down, it actually is co-rage, with rage. And to be courageous about something is to ragefully, furiously, I will do this. I'm going to do this. And it is a sense of like a fire within you.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of what I get in Buddhism is kind of a more cool, wet, watery application of perhaps courage would be an ability to not be reactive.
Yeah, right.
And that to me does not match up with the fire inside.
Yeah.
And when I'm practicing and I have unwholesome thoughts, is it courageous to be like, I'm going to get this right. I'm fired up. I want to overcome this thought. I want to take this stuff down.
Yeah,
no
yeah.
more bad thoughts, man. No more bad thoughts. Or
Yeah,
is it,
yeah.
okay, that's a bad thought. Like, let's let that, as they say, passing of the cloud. But
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't sound very courageous to me.
Yeah. You see what I'm saying? Words are limited. So that's why even courage doesn't quite do it. But I think most people would put courage in a positive tone. You're putting it in a little bit of a negative tone, which is probably accurate actually, because there's that element to it. So I think it just depends on the question is, in that given moment, so this would be the word compassion would make sense here. Compassion is both soft and it's also both fierce. So sometimes we need to soften, and sometimes we need to stand up. And knowing, first of all, it's good to know the way you're wired. Some people are a little bit like passive aggressive. So it's good to know our disposition, but it's not always clear, is it? Sometimes we just need to back off and let it go. But sometimes we might need to go, hey, actually, this is like, so again, it's context dependent, I think. It's also good to know your disposition. Because the trick about the hindrances that I'll give you is you can't use any of the hindrances to overcome any of the other hindrances. Because if not, aversion would be awesome and none of us would even be here right now. Imagine if aversion worked. Imagine if you just wanted shit to be different and then it was different immediately. Oh my God, right? Life would be so boring.
I had never heard or considered the word rage as part of courage. However, I did study French in college, and cour, C-O-U-R, courage, means to come from with heart.
Right.
And compassion. And so that's how I've always looked at courage, of with heart and compassion,
Yeah.
as opposed to rage.
Yeah, see, depending on what, yeah, you put them in different linguistic boxes and it starts to become very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Well, back to that one thing that, and this will be your homework in a couple months to give you some foreshadow. It's like the choice of the word is not that important. You're using language is deeply personal, frankly, I believe. So using the word that makes sense for you is the right thing to do. If you're like, that's not it. So part of it is trying to, uh, part of the framing is using word choices that actually work for you. If it doesn't work for you, then put it aside. It's like not that, it's not that important actually. Yeah, Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, the word that keeps dropping in for me is wisdom.
Oh, sure.
as as we get to know ourselves, like asking those questions actually to me is that form of wisdom of um, well, what would be appropriate for me right now? What would be helpful? What would be constructive? What would be, and there's this place for me of building that level of confidence
Yeah.
or courage of how I work with things that then to me translates into wisdom. So
Yep.
kind of going back to where you started, I love that.
Yeah, on the AA coin it says to thine own self be true. To know that, oh, different people talk about, I forget Socrates talks like wisdom is the love of night. It's like to know oneself, is a big part of it. I don't want to, I want to stay a little bit on time. So why don't we take about a 6-minute break and then I want to come back and do this longer practice of Sila, which we probably haven't done in a guided practice. I always like to do that because it really works for the first effort. So why don't we just take a short break if you need to use the bathroom or get some water, and I'll ring the bell here in a couple minutes. All right, we're going to come back and do some practice. So I'll just kind of say a few words about this as people are kind of coming back in. So usually when we hear the word sila, which I think is a really important part of the practice, it can be translated in a number of ways. I think the way that it's translated, not so much anymore, thankfully, but I think is most been problematic is morality. Ethical is probably better, but even that word's a little bit too dry, isn't it? I think the word is integrity is the word that I would, if I had to translate it in one word, I would call it integrity. And again, that would be about being aligned with our sense of values. And usually it's kind of taught, in the speech, action, livelihood domain. But I was fortunate enough, one of my teachers, Stephen Smith, I was taught this as a guided meditation practice, which is what we'll do now, which I found to be helpful because in the Burmese tradition, and particularly the lay Sayadaw school, Sayadaw Pandita, there's a term they use called Sila Brahma Vihara. And it's understood that Sila is really kind of the first Brahma Vihara. And it gives us access to things like kindness and compassion and gratitude and equanimity. So when you think about cultivation, we have these seeds of Brahma Viharas, but the soil that we plant these seeds in is the soil of Sila, or integrity. And how that works internally, so I would just, maybe when we talk about liberation or nibbana, a lot of these words, the word that I would use in this context would be freedom. And I think we can recognize Sila when we kind of turn towards ourselves, what we're looking for to access, to recognize, that's not maybe that hard, is your own wish or your own basic desire to be free. Whatever that means for you, it probably means something different to everybody. But we have that, and that's a really beautiful thing to just recognize, like, oh, life is hard, to struggle. I just want to be free. And freedom in an American context is greatly misunderstood. Usually when we think of the word freedom, we think about we want to be free to. Free to do this, free to do that. We live in a free country. I do whatever the hell I want to do, whenever the hell I want to do it. That's not really what we're talking about here. Freedom in this context is free from. What do I want to, what's going on in my internal life? What's going on inside of me? I want to be free from this. These hindrances, this struggle, this narrative, this story, this view, this attitude. If you really got honest, you'd probably make a pretty impressive list of things you want to be free from. And so this is where the word desire becomes really important. A lot of times desire gets shown under a negative light in Buddhist practice, but it really shouldn't, because desire is really, really important. There's this word Dhammachanda, which is really translated as the desire for freedom. It's like, oh man, I want to be free. And so that desire is really where Sila begins and lives, and that's the dimension of our heart that we want to be able to access, is this. And just this desire to be free, that's it, that's all you need. It can be small, it can be a little, it can be even mysterious, but that's really what we're looking for, because once we recognize that, then we're able to move through the entire project, through the entire process, a lot more importantly, because we recognize, no, I actually want this. And not only do I want this, desire also has a dimension of deservedness. Like, I deserve to be free. I want to be free. I deserve to be free. I'm going to be free. And that movement of the heart is something that you carry with you through the entire process. That even starts to take on a quality of what they call faith or sada. It's like, yeah, like I'm going to do this. And I refuse to let anything get in my way. Like, I'm going to embrace this process. So when we can get a sense of that, so that can become, that's what we'll do right now. You think about the object of meditation. Usually we use the body and the breath, which is fine, but use that. That's what I would call a heart-based object. Usually we use somatic objects for meditation, which is fine, but they haven't, for me, it hasn't been enough. You know, the body and the breath, they don't really quite do it for me. But if I can get into this, oh yeah, like I want to be free. And you say, well, is that an object? It's like, well, I don't know, is it? If you can recognize it, it's an object. Anything that's recognizable by the mind can become an object. It doesn't have to be material. It's what they would call technically an immaterial object. Kindness is an immaterial object. The breath is a material object, because it's material. It's right there. Kindness, where's the kindness? Maybe it's not as far away as you thought. So it's learning to do the practice Sila Brahma Vihara. It's really learning how to use immaterial objects as a base of practice. And I have found for me that that's way better for me. It's like I'm way more engaged. I'm way more interested. You know, it's got a little bit more juice to it, rather than rising and falling with the in and out breath. It doesn't do it for me. So let's give it a shot. We'll do this for maybe about 15 or 20 minutes. And just to be, not to be warned, but just to be clear, this will be, the instructions are a little odd. So just try it on, bear with me. It's a little bit stranger of a framing. So just, and also just be here. If you didn't have a desire to be free, you certainly would not be here right now. So clearly it's there. Right. So we'll start and end with the bell. All right, thank you for your practice. So before we have some questions or discussion, one of the reasons I like to teach that now is when we think about this kind of what I would call the hinge of the path, where we're opening to this space of like, we're trying to recognize and overcome these kind of destructive forces in the mind, and we want to develop and maintain these wholesome ones. In the mindfulness teachings, you hear about these awakening factors, which is fine and good. They're really important. But the interesting thing I think that can happen, and it's kind of what I was trying to do there, is you can really see these Brahma Vihara practices as companions to the awakening factors. When the Buddha speaks of liberation, he speaks of Chitta Vimutti and Panya Vimutti, liberation through wisdom, liberation through the heart, which both are fine and appropriate avenues. But this Chitta Vimutti, when we see these Brahma Vihara practices, sometimes they have a little bit more, they have a heavier embodied, sometimes even more transformative component to them, that when we can start to again, using an object of practice that's more immaterial or heart-based, I have found that to be a lot more valuable to the point where I don't even really use that much body-based practices anymore. So you could see those as companions. And there are also ways of developing and maintaining these qualities. But does anybody have any questions? Are fine, but I'm more interested in how was that for you? What did you notice? What came up? Yeah, please. Thank you, Joe.
I'm Carolyn, and I found it to be very relaxing. Very relaxing. There's a practice I do sometimes at night, regardless if I'm sleepy or not, where I just think to myself, the next 8 hours are for me. I can just let it all go. And it started to remind me of that, but I didn't fall asleep. It was a very similar feeling in the body. And then I also noticed how harder it got to grasp on a thought. There were a couple times when I, went somewhere and I couldn't, like my brain didn't want to do that. It's kind of cool. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that because I think that's a natural progression. I think when the mind appreciates the absence of thought as kind of like pretty good, it tends to want to gravitate to it. Where it's like, you know what, actually, let's just stay here for a little while. That's pretty good. Because so there's a way in which sometimes a heart-based object like that will bring us into the experience a little bit more, where there's not, because mindfulness does have this emphasizing of the watching, the just pay attention, just observe these things, but there's not a lot of, so when the body has that kind of relief, relaxation, it's easier to stay with that, because you're like, that's pretty good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So, kind of hearkening back to that concept of, are we basically good? It occurs to me that it's almost like a homeostatic condition, the need to be free.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think, the sixth grade biology word homeostasis is very relevant in that conversation because there's that. So we could maybe we could just call that well-being, So again, we're not making a claim about whether I'm good or bad. We're just saying, well, well-being is a quality that's available. And equanimity could be almost translated as homeostasis, at least on the biological, the somatic side.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying also is that it feels innate.
Yeah.
Right, that need for liberation feels innate.
Yeah. I think that's right, yeah. Anybody just have a really hard time with it? Yeah? All right, now the truth comes out. I love it. Yeah. Could you say a little bit about that?
I'm Jessica. I found it difficult, but not necessarily agitating.
Sure, yeah.
It was just so vague and nebulous. Like, I think I'm just so trained to pick something.
Yeah.
Pick something that's material, tangible. And so and I'm familiar with the Brahma Viharas, but then this, and I do metta, but somehow this was very different.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was just in this moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was kind of just wandering.
Yeah. But it was not a problem.
It wasn't homeostasis. It wasn't. It didn't feel like I was getting it.
Yeah, right. But you were looking
but I
for
wasn't
it.
like trying to run out of the room.
Yeah. But would you think in the wandering there was a looking for without a finding?
I do another, but I take it all back to the body. Like I try and feel longing in the body.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to go back to something. I felt that
Yeah.
pull.
Did you feel longing in the body?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What would you say that was? Because longing is an interesting word because it can have a positive or a negative connotation to it depending. Because longing can be like desirous in a good way, but longing can also be like, oh, it's a really interesting feeling.
Mm-hmm. Longing usually shows up somewhere in my chest, somewhere around my heart,
Yeah.
as more of a softer quality.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I always do the disclaimer of like, you've practiced a bunch. So this is like, it does have that, you're like, this is different, but it's kind of similar at the same time. So I'd be curious to see if that change or morphs over time. Because it is a kind of a Brahma Vihara-like practice, but it doesn't have the specific quality like that we might use with traditional phrases or so forth.
I'm curious to how it's different from metta, because I always usually my last
Yeah.
phrase is,
Yeah.
"May I be free."
It might not be, actually. Oh.
Okay, then that's familiar.
Yeah, right.
But I was
yeah.
trying to make it
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, right. Maybe, so that, I don't know, like that's interesting. Like, is it just a meta adjacent practice? And I think many ways it might be, right? Yeah. Yeah, but we're looking for the desire for it more so than it, maybe. So there might be a little bit of the emphasis might be a little bit different. Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. It's always interesting to see how we do these little experiments and all kinds of stuff happens, right? Yeah. Any Zoomers have any questions? Not to categorize you guys in terms of generations. What time is it? Oh, wow. So I'll talk about mindfulness a little bit in the context of that. So let me just give me a second. So this might be worthwhile because I think it's in the Rizuku. It's so funny too because like I always find myself, because mindfulness is such the predominant thing, I'm like always like feeling reluctant to talk about mindfulness. But let's just kind of I want to actually offer some dimensions of mindfulness practice that don't really get discussed, and that is another list of 4, many lists of 4s. And when you look at the way, so there's a guy named Rupert Gethin who's really one of the most world's respected Pali scholars, who's also a meditator, who did an analysis. So the word for mindfulness is this word sati. So when you look at the Eightfold Path, you see samasati, and it's usually, if you look in 99% of the books, they'll give you a explanation of the foundations of mindfulness. So I'm not going to do that because you can find that elsewhere, and you're probably many of you are very familiar with it. But the way that he goes through it and says, well, there's actually 4 particular ways the word sati is described throughout the entire canon, and I think I want to talk about that a little bit because it's helpful. And it's confusing because the way that it's understood is sati is understood to have different functions on different occasions for different purposes. So mindfulness has different functions. It functions differently on different occasions. That is to say, it's context dependent for different purposes. So it's a very dynamic, adaptive word. So that's why trying to define mindfulness is such a fool's errand, because the mindfulness that I would have at my son's graduation, or the equanimity I would have at my son's graduation, would be different than the equanimity I would have at my sister's wedding versus the different kind of mindfulness or equanimity I might have at my father's funeral. Right? So it's very context dependent. It doesn't always feel the same. And I'll go through them, but I want to focus on the first one because I think it's relevant to what we've been doing today. So there's a mindfulness that would be called simple awareness, or really what's called existential mindfulness. Not necessarily existential philosophy, but not necessarily not that either. But when we practice existential mindfulness, it's kind of what we do in mindfulness of breathing. Is existential mindfulness is really, really tuning deeply into the present time experience. So we get into the subtleties of the body. We monitor the arising of the in-breath, the passing away of the out-breath. It's really being tuned into the phenomenological experience, that which is really happening in the context of sort of what we call now. And for those of you who've been doing this for a while, you've been on retreat, it's like when you start to get tuned into the present moment experience, there's like a lot going on all the time, you know? So the idea of getting bored is like almost impossible. But it's really, and this is really a lot when we talk about, I think Mike mentioned about how do we embrace life. This is really where the application of mindfulness becomes existential. And so that kind of mindfulness has different applications and different purposes. So if we go sit a 7-day retreat somewhere, if we're out at Vallecitos for 7 days, in many ways we're practicing existential mindfulness. We're just trying to be in the experience that we're actually in, which is not that hard, not that easy to do, because the mind, again, goes into concepts, goes into past, goes into future. So we really have to develop this capacity of mindfulness to be tuned into the 5 sense experience, which a lot of emphasis on that, tuned into the body, tuned into the external world, and really trying to be what, if you watch that video on John Vervaeke, he talks about, I think in that video, he talks what happens to people that kind of gets us in a lot of trouble is what's called modal confusion. And so modal confusion is we live in a world that's dictated by the having mode and the having mode and the doing mode. You know the mode of having? I'm going to have this and I'm going to have that. I got to having and doing. I'm going to have this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. I'm going to have that. And if I have the right things and do the right things, then maybe I'll be happy. Right? Which most people haven't really figured that out. So mindfulness, existential mindfulness, is about the being mode, right? Where the switches we're trying to, you know, can I find well-being? Can I just sit in the woods? Can I just sit in a chair? Can I just be a person in a moment and be okay without having or doing anything to get to need to have to get that? You see how that works? So they think we get modally confused. Because we see people in our society who apparently have everything. They're not happy. Right? And so it's trying to understand. So mindfulness, what the Buddha awoke to was the being mode through the practice of mindfulness. And that's what we take a 20-minute period and we practice being in the present moment experience for that period of time, which is really, really important. And I'll tell you what, for 30 years, it's still pretty hard. Because what happens is my mind imagines what I could have, what I could do that would be better than this, right? So that's a really important distinction to make as we're trying to become more being mode. I remember when I worked with my trauma therapist, she talks about being a doer and a beer. She's like, you, my friend, are not a beer. You are a doer. And I took that as a great compliment at the time. Turned out not to be the case. But that doesn't mean we just want to be either. Like we do also have, but we just have to prioritize. You know, because if I understand the being mode more deeply, then I can make better choices and make better assessments about what I need to have or what I might do as a result of that. So we just get them backwards, right? So that's that kind of, you know, existential mindfulness. So if you sit for 30 minutes in the morning, you're really kind of practicing that. You're just practicing trying to stay in the moment, trying to practice. And you have to practice that. You can't just decide that. You can't just decide any of this stuff. You can decide to practice or not, but you just can't decide that you're just going to be in the being mode from now because that sounds better. Right? So again, this is why the mind, as someone asked me earlier, is why I think the Buddha really got it right, even though there's a lot of other philosophical traditions or other lines of thinking that people have developed that make sense to us, but he's saying you're really going to just have to learn how to do this stuff. So that's the first kind. The second kind is what's called, sometimes it's called protective awareness, but I like to call it therapeutic mindfulness. So therapeutic mindfulness is, this is actually, I give a lot of credit to Jon Kabat-Zinn for this. Because a lot of people, really nowadays, it's very, very common. Maybe some of you are fall into this category. A lot of people get into the Dharma through the mindfulness-based stress reduction world. They learn mindfulness from a therapist, or they went to addiction treatment. They learned mindfulness in some therapeutic setting, and then they come into a room like this. That's very common. It's more likely the case nowadays. And mindfulness does have tremendous therapeutic value, but it's not all just that, because therapeutic mindfulness is, again, it's that ability to recognize that I'm having a destructive force in my mind, and I have some therapeutic chops. I know what to do with this, right? It's that know-how. I know I have anger and fear in my mind, and I know how to do something to free myself from it, to shake the shackles of that a little bit, and that is tremendously therapeutic value. The reason where that becomes problematic is mindfulness becomes a tool for fixing everything. You know, we have to be very careful about the fixing. You know, and so that's where a lot of people just see it for its therapeutic value, which it has. In the Pali discourses, they call it protective, which I think is also good. It's really trying to protect ourselves by being careful what we pay attention to. Right? And so that there is a tremendous therapeutic value. It's helpful to us. Mindfulness is, you know, when you look at mental health, which is a space I occupy a lot, you know, any therapeutic intervention that starts to get like evidence-based, that starts to go, hey, this works pretty good, they always park the word mindfulness-based right in front of it. Like CBT was popular for decades, cognitive behavioral therapy. And they're like, well, if cognitive behavioral therapy patients have a little mindfulness, they actually do a lot better. I work with a lot of people who are therapists, and a lot of them say when someone new comes into their office with a mindfulness practice, they're so relieved. It's like, oh, wow, we're going to get so much done. You know, so there's that tremendous value to it. So if you're taking a walk in the woods, if you're out in nature, you should be exploring existential mindfulness. You don't need therapeutic mindfulness so much. You don't need to fix anything. But if you're at work, or if you're having an argument with a friend or a loved one, if you're in the context and the busyness of life, the mindfulness, probably the therapeutic mindfulness, is probably the function of mindfulness that you want to use in our kind of busy day-to-day, go-to-go life. Does that make sense? Like, okay, like I'm getting worked up over here. That person did that thing, they said that thing, so there's a protective quality to it. Protecting our mind, really probably more likely protecting our heart than our minds. And then the third kind of mindfulness is what's called contemplative mindfulness, or sometimes it's called introspective awareness. And they all play on each other. They all build on each other. So when the existential mindfulness kind of falls short, we can use the therapeutic mindfulness when that falls short. So in the introspective mindfulness, the contemplative mindfulness, that's being able to look within the mind and notice what's happening there. So for example, like if you are taking a hike, if you're out in nature, if you're doing something that's kind of drawing or walking or painting or anything that has a creative endeavor to it, you don't need to have therapeutic mindfulness for that. You need to have contemplative. And mindfulness is a contemplative practice. So it's being able to it's not thinking, but it's thinking in a different kind of way. This word contemplation. You all know this word, right? It's a good word, actually. I think mindfulness, it is a contemplative practice. I don't like the word meditation so much, the word contemplative. Having a contemplative life. There's actually a discipline now called contemplative neuroscience. If I could go back to school, not that I ever went to school anyway, but that sounds like an interesting thing to take. It's like, how do we, the ability to monitor and to be in the mind in a contemplative way. So there's a lot of the mindfulness that we how many times do you find yourself doing something that would be contemplative, whether you're taking a walk or riding a bike, and you spend the whole time just thinking about some stupid shit that happened earlier that day? You go for a hike, an elephant could have walked by and you wouldn't even have seen it. Because you're just like, oh, I can't believe those people did this. It's just like, so a lot of times we're not in the right function of mindfulness for that kind of thing. We need to learn how to do all three. We need to learn how to be existential, to be really tuned into things on a slow way. We need to be able to have, sometimes they call it fast mindfulness, being able to, because our lives are busy. Most of the time I know, I try not to be that busy, but sometimes I'm busy trying to not be busy, which is weird if you've ever been in those moments, So we want to have that ability to be able to recognize these things. This a lot of times is in the context of working with other people. And then the fourth kind of mindfulness is ethical mindfulness, which is really about making choices or saying things or how we engage in the world in a way that's more aligned with what we're doing. In the discourses, it's called deliberately forming conceptions. And that's intentional, that's deliberate, that's doing things, as John Kabat-Zinn's, on purpose in a particular way. It's that kind of, and if we start looking at our lives, I don't know about you, but life is really just one ethical dilemma after another. Should I or shouldn't I? And then we assess the list of, well, should I do this? Well, if I do this, then that might happen, that might happen. And if I do this, this would be bad. I should do that. I shouldn't do this. I mean, I don't know about you, but this is the shit I think about all the time. Should I let my 6-year-old have a bowl of ice cream at 7 o'clock in the morning because he really seems to want it? And if I give it to him, it will be good for me. Do I do that? Do I, and sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't, it's like, that's just, but so much of our life is haunted by this idea of and to be more tuned in this and not to be like, well, if I give him the bowl of ice cream, then I'm a bad dad. And we get into all this moral dilemmas. It's just like, no, like what's, this context dependent learning of like, what might be, it's not even skillful learning to go, what might be skillful, And that a lot of times we can get really rigid around that kind of stuff. We can get really, really analytical around that kind of stuff. Really judgmental around that kind of stuff. And so we can see that mindfulness, there's different kinds. And so it's good to learn how to practice all four of those in different ways and seeing that there's different kinds of mindfulness on different occasions for different purposes. Like taking a walk requires a different kind of mindfulness than being at a board meeting or being in conversation with a bunch of different people versus just sitting quietly on a cushion in your house for 30 minutes a day, as you probably find yourself doing. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what it does is it gives us a little bit more dynamic of a way of viewing the practice. So mindfulness what it does is it takes mindfulness out of its technique mode. Like, I got to learn the mindfulness technique. I learn the mindfulness technique, and then I'm going to learn it and master it, and then I'm going to just apply it across everything as a general rule. It's probably not really even possible. So again, mindfulness isn't a technique, it's modal. It's a mode. It's the being mode. Now, there's certain, as we know, there's certain things you might do that are techniques that might encourage the mindfulness experience to emerge. You might put your attention on your breathing, and you notice if you do that, the mind slows down and you're more aware. But the technique, there's many different techniques. We don't want to become too focused on learning the technique. We want to be more focused on just noticing that we're just more attuned or we're more checked in with our experience than we have. And this is great because this is something that you can just be doing all the time. It doesn't have to be specialized. Because most of us, I always tell people I work with, like, if you can sit 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, and get on like a retreat a year, for most of us, that's like about as much as we can do. That's the most that I can do. I try to get on 1 or 2 retreats a year. I generally can. I try to sit 5 days a week. I generally can, but I don't always do it. And sometimes that's like a lot. What about the rest of the time? So it's, again, using the dimensions of the path to really try to bring the practice into everything that we do, so we don't get into that split I mentioned earlier of like, there's my life that I'm living, and then there's my practice, and there's a non-integrated experience. I always find that feels very unsatisfied when I feel like I'm not doing the thing I'm supposed to be doing. Was I supposed to be doing something? What was it again? You know, and we don't feel tuned into the experience. So we have a little bit of time left. Any follow-up questions or things you want to ask or say more about before we kind of move on?
Maybe this is, practice number 2 in your 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
But I know, I'm sorry. This might, so the question is, this might be kind of practice number 2 in trying to integrate, between sitting on a cushion, which is hard for me to do. But I love to clean my house.
I do too.
I just, it's like the process of just getting involved in paying attention to what are my hands doing, what am I feeling, how am I making this place. Well, it also does a healthy thing of, like, after I clean the house, yes, my nose is draining, but when it's done, when I put the vacuum cleaner away, all of a sudden my entire body feels like flow. I just feel so wonderful that then I can sit.
Yeah. Well, let me walk you through that, because that's really great. I feel the same way. And also there's a lot of research to suggest that the external environment that we're in has an impact on the internal landscape, right? Like, I like cleaning the house too. So existentially, I might feel off. I might feel dissatisfied. I might feel it's a little too cluttery in here. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to engage in some therapeutic mindfulness, and I'm going to clean. But I'm not just going to clean. I'm actually going to be mindful while I'm doing it. And then when the house is clean, I can sit and look at the clean house, and that's contemplative mindfulness, right? There's a way, the question is, can you go from cleaning to sitting on the chair and appreciating the house that's clean? Or do you just go to the next room? Right? You're like, by the way, the garage is a mess too. And just like, yeah. But if the therapeutic goes on for too long, it becomes sort of you know what I mean? So there's a way in which we can see that there's different kinds of modes, because, the question is, can you sit and have a cup of tea for 30 minutes after the fact and really appreciate that and look around, right? You see what I mean? There are different modes of that way of being it. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, well, we'll say that too. It's like, me and my wife will be talking, I'm like, I'm having a lot of dukkha right now. I'm gonna take this dukkha out on the kitchen, and everybody's gonna benefit. It's like, no big deal. Yeah, but it's good that you know that about yourself. You're like, I know that there's something that I can do that's going to have therapeutic value for me. Yeah, I see that, but that's a very off the cushion thing, right? Most people wouldn't see that as a practice. So maybe as you do that, you could maybe actually just see what it'd be like if you actually just tried to bring more practice to that. It sounds like you're already doing it, but it might be interesting if you just really be like, okay, this is going to be the practice for the next 45 minutes. Yeah, that's right. Because you're either way you're cleaning the house, but am I doing it from a place of have to and restlessness and aversion? Or am I doing it from a place of interest and it's not the activity, it's the way that it's context dependent. It's like, how am I? How am I? Not what am I doing, but how am I doing it?
And I've noticed that, just like, cleaning the house is once I make that shift.
Yeah, right.
It becomes a joyful experience.
Because it's mindfulness, and it's intentional, and it's on purpose. Yeah. I mean, I can love doing the dishes, or man, I can hate doing the dishes. It's all the same. It's the same thing. It's how am I? How am I? And that's great. And that's very, I think sometimes they used to call us householders. Like, if you're not a monastic, you're a householder. And sometimes that applies. Yeah, thank you. It's great. Well, thank you for being here. A couple, so I think I don't have the schedule in front of me. You'll have to look. I'll send it out. So please, make sure you are tuned into the Rizuku, because I send messages through that. Was it April? It's April now, right? April, May. Yeah. Yeah, a couple more days. I just got used to March, and it's April. So May and June we'll meet online. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure what we're going to talk about next. I'm kind of going to sit on this and think about it. It also doesn't matter. That's the whole point of this whole thing. It's like, what's the next path factor? It doesn't matter, but I do have to pick one. So there you go. And so we'll be mostly moving into, for the next time, we'll be looking at, I will give you, I don't know the order, but we'll be looking at kind of what are called the ethical or SELA path factors. So we'll be looking at like right speech, as it's traditionally known, speech, action, livelihood. But those ones will probably reframe those more so than any of the other ones I have, because these are the ones that most of us deal with. Does anybody here have a job? Does anybody have a job that comes with dukkha, right? And so this doesn't get addressed so much, but this is the kind of stuff that it's like when we think about like when our lives, there's what I want to do and there's what I have to do. And every day I wake up in that situation. There's things that I want to do and there's things that I have to do. And the have to do things usually are associated with getting money to pay for the things that my family needs. And so when we think about livelihood, we oftentimes, for no fault of our own, but when we think about right livelihood, we think about like, okay, I'm a Buddhist, I want to practice right livelihood. That means I need to have a nice job at an environmental nonprofit organization, which is all true and fine, but it's more about survival, what we have to do to survive, which really has to do with our relationship to money, which is, for most people, a total mess. Some people are obsessed with money all the time. That's all I can think about. Some people don't even want to deal with it. And trying to take that on as a practice. Because I don't know, a lot of times too, what we have to do to survive is not what we want to do. I know I've spent many years of my life doing things I didn't want to do because I wanted to have a house and wanted to eat. And this is a serious problem, especially right now, because I don't know if you've noticed, but living in America does not get easier. It gets harder. So it's important that we can maybe think about these as parts of our practice rather than things that are in the way of our practice. So there'll be a couple more videos. I recorded a whole series of conversations with Stephen Batchelor and myself. Some of those will be in there. So I'll put some traditional stuff in there and some videos. I won't put too much in there. I'll put some more guided meditations in there. And then we'll meet in May and then June. And I think we'll be back here in July. To really kind of talk about those three. So we'll really be looking at those three for the next little bit. Speech, communication, voice, work, livelihood, all that kind of stuff. And then from there, we'll go on to the next. So does that sound reasonable?